Hi, and welcome to the Archive of History. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. The sun is setting over the Mediterranean Sea, painting the waters in shades of amber and rose gold. The air is warm, carrying with it the mingled scents of salt spray, burning oil lamps, and something else, something uniquely precious. It is the scent of papyrus, of ink made from soot and gum, of ancient parchment and carefully preserved scrolls. You are standing at the threshold of the greatest repository of human knowledge the world has ever known. Before you rise columns of white marble, their surfaces catching the last light of day, gleaming like pillars of frozen moonlight. Beyond these columns, through grand doorways carved with images of the 9 muses, lie corridors that stretch into shadows, lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelves, and upon those shelves rest hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Each one contains a fragment of human genius, a piece of our collective memory, a whisper from minds both brilliant and long departed. This is the Library of Alexandria. You have heard the name before, perhaps spoken with reverence or with sorrow. It is a name that echoes through history like a ghost, like a promise of something magnificent that was lost before its time. Tonight we will walk together through its marble halls. We will meet the scholars who devoted their lives to the pursuit of knowledge within its walls. We will unroll the scrolls with careful hands and read, by flickering lamplight, the words that shaped civilizations. And we will bear witness, with quiet sadness, to the slow, tragic destruction of this temple of learning, this beacon of human achievement, that once stood as proof of what we are capable of, when we dedicate ourselves to understanding rather than conquest, to preservation rather than destruction. Before we drift off, I'm always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from, and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. Are you wrapped in blankets as winter rain falls outside your window? Are you listening in the deep hours of night when the world is silent? Or perhaps it is early morning where you are. The first grey light of dawn just beginning to touch your walls. Wherever you are, whatever the hour, you are welcome here. You are about to embark on a journey through time, to a place that no longer exists except in memory and in the fragments that survived its destruction. The story of the Library of Alexandria is not simply the story of a building or even a collection of books. It is the story of humanity's first great attempt to gather all knowledge in one place, to create a complete record of everything we had learned, everything we had discovered, everything we had dreamed. It is a story of ambition and genius, of cultural exchange and intellectual fearlessness. It is also a story of loss, of how easily the accumulated wisdom of centuries can be scattered like ash on the wind, how fragile our grasp on knowledge truly is, and how the destruction of a library is not merely the burning of paper and ink, but the erasure of possibilities, the silencing of voices that will never speak again. Tonight we will not simply recount facts and dates, though those will come in their proper time. Instead, we will try to feel what it was like to be there, to walk those corridors, to breathe that air, to hold those scrolls in our hands with the reverence they deserved. We will try to understand not just what was lost, but what it meant, what it could have meant, and what its destruction cost us as a species. We will imagine the scholars hunched over their work by lamplight, the scribes carefully copying texts letter by letter, the librarians climbing tall ladders to retrieve scrolls from the highest shelves, the visiting students from distant lands coming to study at the feet of the greatest minds of their age. This is not a tale of heroes and villains, though those elements exist within it. It is a more complex story, a more human one. It is about how civilizations rise and fall, how values change, how what one age considers precious another may deem worthless or even dangerous. It is about the eternal tension between faith and reason, between the old and the new, between preservation and destruction. It is about fire and water, time and neglect, zealotry and indifference, and ultimately, it is about us, about what we choose to remember and what we allow ourselves to forget. The library is gone now. The great marble halls have crumbled into dust. The shelves stand empty, if they stand at all. The scrolls, those hundreds of thousands of carefully preserved documents, have long since been consumed by flames, scattered by mobs, or simply left to rot in the damp air of a changing world. We cannot bring them back. We cannot restore what was lost, but we can remember. We can try to understand what once was, and in understanding, perhaps we can learn something about ourselves, about the fragility of our achievements, and the responsibility we bear to protect the knowledge we have inherited, and to pass it on, intact, to those who will come after us. So settle in now. Let the concerns of your day fade into the background. The bills that need paying, the messages that need answering, the appointments that need keeping, all of these can wait. Let your breathing slow. Feel the weight of your body against whatever surface supports you. Let your mind drift backwards through the centuries, backwards through time, until you find yourself standing once again at the threshold of that magnificent building, as the last light of day fades from the marble columns and the oil lamps begin to flicker to life inside. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let yourself be transported to a time when the greatest minds of the ancient world walked these halls, when the sum of human knowledge could be contained within a single institution, when Alexandria was not just a city but a dream made manifest, a promise that we could understand everything, that we could preserve everything, that we could build something that would last forever. We are about to discover what that promise looked like, what it felt like, and why it could not be kept. This is the story of the Library of Alexandria, and of what was lost when its light was extinguished. This is a story of knowledge and ignorance, of brilliance and barbarism, of everything we once had and everything we can never recover. Come, the doors are open, the lamps are lit, the scrolls are waiting. Let us step inside together and see what wonders once resided here, in this impossible place, in this cathedral of the mind. Now, before we can understand what was lost, we must first understand what was built. We must travel back even further in time, to the moment when Alexandria itself was born, when a young conqueror looked upon the Egyptian coast and saw not what was, but what could be. We must meet the men who transformed that vision into reality, who took the wealth of an ancient kingdom and poured it into the creation of something unprecedented. We must see how a city rose from the desert sand and became in a remarkably short time the intellectual capital of the known world. Only then can we truly appreciate the magnitude of what would eventually be destroyed and the depth of the shadow that destruction cast across the centuries that followed. Now comes the hardest part of our story. Now we must reckon with what was lost when the Library of Alexandria was destroyed. We must try to imagine the texts that once sat on those shelves, the voices that once spoke through those scrolls, and we must confront the painful reality that they are gone forever. We can list what we know was lost, but we cannot experience it. We can describe the shapes of the absence, but we cannot fill the void. This is the cruelest aspect of the library's destruction. It is not simply that something was taken from us. It is that we can never fully know what was taken. Consider the plays of the great Athenian dramatists. We know from ancient catalogues and references that Aeschylus wrote somewhere between 70 and 90 plays. Of these, only 7 survive complete. Sophocles wrote over 120 plays. We have 7. Euripides wrote 92 plays. We have 18. And some of these are fragmentary. The rest are lost, almost certainly destroyed when the library was destroyed. Imagine what this means. We are missing more than 90% of the dramatic output of classical Athens, the works that defined tragedy and comedy as art forms, that explored the deepest questions of human existence, justice, fate, the nature of the gods, the limits of human understanding. We have fragments, quotations in other works, occasional lines preserved because a later grammarian wanted to illustrate some point of usage, but the plays themselves are gone. Among Aeschylus's lost works are plays about Achilles, about Odysseus, about the lesser-known heroes of myth, whose stories we now know only in outline. Sophocles wrote plays about Ajax's son, about the madness of Heracles, about figures from the Trojan War whose names are barely remembered today. Euripides had an entire trilogy about the fall of Troy that is lost except for fragments. These were not minor works. In their own time, they were performed in Athens' great theatre of Dionysus before audiences of thousands. They won prizes. They were copied and recopied. They were studied and discussed. They shaped how the Greeks understood their own history and mythology. And now they are gone. We cannot read them. We cannot perform them. We cannot know what they said or how they said it. The loss is immeasurable. Or consider history. We have Herodotus and Thucydides, Xenophon and Polybius, a handful of other historians whose works survived because medieval monks considered them important enough to copy. But the library contained hundreds of historical works that are now lost. There were histories of Carthage written by Carthaginians, offering their perspective on the wars with Rome. There were histories of the Persian Empire written by Persian scholars, describing their civilization from the inside rather than through the hostile or condescending eyes of Greek observers. There were detailed accounts of Alexander's campaigns written by his generals, men who had actually been there, who had seen the battles and the negotiations and the internal political struggles of the Macedonian court. We have later histories that drew on these sources, but the original accounts are lost. We are seeing Alexander through multiple layers of interpretation and agenda, never directly. The loss of scientific works is perhaps even more damaging in terms of human progress. We know that Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system in the 3rd century before the Common Era. We know this because later writers mentioned it, but his actual work, the calculations and observations that led him to this conclusion, the detailed arguments he made in defense of his theory, all of this is lost. If it had survived, if Renaissance astronomers had been able to read Aristarchus's original treatise rather than just brief summaries, might the scientific revolution have come earlier? It is impossible to say, but the question haunts us. Similarly, we know that Eratosthenes wrote a comprehensive work on geography, describing the known world with remarkable accuracy. The work is lost. We have only fragments and summaries. We know that Herophilus conducted extensive anatomical studies and wrote detailed treatises on what he discovered. Those treatises are gone. Medieval and Renaissance physicians had to rediscover through their own dissections what Herophilus had already known in the 3rd century before the Common Era. How much suffering could have been alleviated? How many lives could have been saved if his medical knowledge had been preserved and transmitted? The mathematical losses are equally profound. Euclid's Elements survived, but many of his other works did not. We have references to treatises on advanced geometry, on optics, on the theory of music, all now lost. Archimedes, who worked in Syracuse but whose works were certainly in the library, wrote on mechanics and hydrostatics. Some of his works survived, but others did not. One of his lost works, on the method of discovery, was only rediscovered in the 20th century in a palimpsest, a recycled parchment where the original text had been partially scraped off so the parchment could be reused. If such a major work could disappear so completely, how many others vanished without a trace? The literary losses extend beyond drama. We have fragments of Greek lyric poetry, the works of Sappho and Alcaeus, Anacreon and Simonides. These fragments are so beautiful, so perfectly crafted, that they make you weep for what was lost. Sappho, perhaps the greatest lyric poet of antiquity, wrote 9 books of poetry. We have one complete poem and a handful of fragments, most of them discovered on damaged papyrus scraps in the sands of Egypt. The rest, everything else she wrote, is gone. Callimachus, whom we have already mentioned, was one of the most influential poets of the Hellenistic age. We have only fragments of his major works. The Roman poet Catullus translated some of Callimachus's poems into Latin, suggesting that they were still available in the 1st century before the Common Era. But by the medieval period, they were lost. And these are just the works we know about, the texts that are mentioned in surviving sources, or appear in ancient catalogues. How many works existed that are not even mentioned? How many poets, philosophers, scientists and historians wrote treatises or poems or plays that were read and valued in their own time but left no trace in the historical record? The library contained 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls. We can identify perhaps a few thousand individual works from surviving references. What about the rest? What was in those scrolls? What voices spoke through them? What ideas did they contain? We will never know. They are not just lost. They have been erased so completely that we do not even know what questions to ask about them. Think about this for a moment. Think about the greatest book you have ever read, the work that changed your life or showed you something you had never seen before. Now imagine that book simply vanishing. Every copy destroyed, every reference to it eliminated, until in a few generations no one remembers it ever existed. This is what happened. Not to one work, but to hundreds of thousands of works. The library was not just a collection of books, it was the collective memory of ancient civilization. When it was destroyed, that memory was fragmented. Parts survived, scattered across other libraries, preserved by chance or by the dedication of individual scholars, but vast portions were simply lost, and we are the poorer for it. There is a terrible irony in the fact that we know so much about what was lost. Ancient bibliographies and catalogues survive, giving us lists of works that no longer exist. Later writers quote from or summarize texts that have vanished. We can trace the outlines of the gaps in our knowledge. We can see the shape of the absence, but we cannot fill it. We cannot bring back what was destroyed. All we can do is mourn and wonder what our civilization might have become if that knowledge had been preserved. If the scientific progress of the Hellenistic age had continued uninterrupted, if the literary and philosophical achievements of antiquity had been fully transmitted to the modern world. Some scholars argue that the loss of the library did not significantly delay human progress, that most important works were copied and preserved elsewhere, that what was lost was primarily derivative or unimportant. But this seems like rationalization, a way of making ourselves feel better about a catastrophic cultural loss. The fact is, we do not know what was lost. We cannot know. The very works that might have most changed our understanding, the texts that contradicted accepted wisdom or proposed radically new ideas, these were perhaps the most likely to be dismissed as dangerous or heretical, and the least likely to be copied and preserved by later generations. The library represented a moment of unusual intellectual openness, a willingness to collect and preserve everything, even works that challenged prevailing beliefs. When that openness ended, when later generations became more selective about what they copied, we lost not just scrolls but possibilities, roads not taken, questions not asked, because the texts that might have prompted those questions were gone. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria is not just ancient history. It is a warning that echoes down through the centuries. Knowledge is fragile. Civilization is fragile. What one generation builds, another can destroy, and once destroyed, some things cannot be recovered. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information, where millions of books are available at the touch of a button. But this abundance should not make us complacent. Libraries can still be destroyed, not just by fire and fanatics, but by neglect, by lack of funding, by the decision that some forms of knowledge are not worth preserving. The lesson of Alexandria is that we must always be vigilant, always working to preserve what we have and to pass it on intact to those who come after us. Because once it is gone forever, and we will never even know all that we have lost. But our story does not end entirely in darkness. While the great majority of the library's collection was lost forever, some works did survive, preserved through a combination of luck, dedication, and the labors of scholars who understood, even in ages of decline, that the texts of the ancients were precious and worth saving. Let us trace these paths of survival, these thin threads of transmission that connect us across the centuries to the library that once was. The preservation of classical texts depended on copying. A papyrus scroll, even under ideal conditions, might last a few hundred years. Most degraded much faster. The only way to preserve a text was to copy it onto new papyrus before the old scroll became unreadable. And in the medieval period, as papyrus became increasingly rare and expensive, texts had to be copied onto parchment, made from animal skin, which was more durable but also more costly. Each act of copying was an act of selection. Some texts were deemed worthy of the time and expense, others were not. And so through this process of repeated copying over many generations, some works survived while others vanished. In the immediate aftermath of the library's decline, some texts were preserved in other libraries scattered across the Hellenistic world. The Library of Pergamon, though it may have been given to Alexandria, had certainly produced copies of important works before then. Other significant collections existed in Rhodes, in Athens, in Antioch. When Alexandria declined, scholars sometimes moved to these other centers, taking copies of texts with them, but these smaller libraries were themselves vulnerable. They too declined, were destroyed in wars, or simply ran out of funding. The survival of a text depended on it being copied and distributed widely enough that when one copy was lost, others remained elsewhere. One crucial pathway of survival ran through the Byzantine Empire. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, continued for another 1,000 years. Byzantine scholars, writing in Greek, continued to read and copy classical texts. They did not preserve everything. They were selective, preferring texts that were useful for education or that aligned with Christian values. But they did preserve a core of classical literature: Plato and Aristotle, Homer and Hesiod, the great tragedians and historians. When Byzantine scholars fled west after the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453, they brought these texts with them, manuscripts that had been copied and recopied over the centuries, ultimately deriving from scrolls that had once sat on the shelves of the Library of Alexandria. Another pathway ran through the Islamic world. When Arab armies conquered the Middle East and North Africa in the 7th and 8th centuries, they encountered a rich tradition of Greek learning. Far from destroying it, as some Christian chronicles claimed, they embraced it. Arab scholars translated vast quantities of Greek texts into Arabic, works of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. They built their own great libraries in Baghdad, in Cordoba, in Cairo. They studied and commented on Aristotle and Galen, Ptolemy and Euclid. They preserved works that had been lost in the Christian West and added their own contributions, advances in algebra, optics, and medicine. When European scholars in the 12th and 13th centuries began to rediscover classical learning, they often did so through Arabic translations. The texts would be translated from Greek to Arabic, then from Arabic to Latin, a complex chain of transmission that sometimes introduced errors, but also preserved knowledge that might otherwise have vanished entirely. Medieval monasteries in Europe also played a role, though a more limited one. Monks copied texts as part of their devotional practice. The scriptorium of a monastery was a place of sacred labor where scribes worked in silence to reproduce the Bible, the works of the Church Fathers, and occasionally classical texts that were considered useful. Boethius, Virgil, parts of Aristotle, translated into Latin, these were deemed acceptable. But pagan poets and playwrights, works that celebrated the old gods or described immoral behavior, these were often neglected. Some monasteries preserved them anyway, recognizing their literary value even if they disapproved of their content. But the selection process was narrow. Much was lost simply because medieval monks did not consider it worth copying. The Renaissance marked a turning point. European scholars, particularly in Italy, became obsessed with recovering the literature of classical antiquity. They searched monastery libraries, corresponded with Byzantine scholars, commissioned new translations from Arabic and Greek. There was a sense that something precious had been lost and might be recovered. Humanists like Petrarch and Poggio Bracciolini dedicated their lives to finding and copying ancient manuscripts. Poggio famously discovered a complete copy of Lucretius's De Reverum Natura, a philosophical poem about atomism and materialism, in a German monastery where it had lain forgotten for centuries. Such discoveries were rare but extraordinarily valuable. Each recovered text was a voice from the ancient world speaking again after centuries of silence. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century was crucial for ensuring that recovered texts would not be lost again. Once a text was printed, it could be reproduced in hundreds or thousands of copies, distributed across Europe, made widely available. The vulnerability of the single manuscript, which could be destroyed by fire or decay or simple carelessness, was overcome. Printing democratized access to knowledge in a way that would have astonished the scholars of Alexandria. The library had been an exclusive institution, accessible only to a privileged few. Printed books could reach anyone who could read, and as literacy spread, that meant an ever-growing proportion of the population. Yet even with printing, the losses remained. The texts that survived to be printed in the 15th and 16th centuries were those that had made it through the bottleneck of medieval copying. Everything that had been lost before then remained lost. Printing could preserve what existed, but it could not resurrect what had been destroyed. The gaps in our classical library, the missing plays and histories and scientific treatises, these remained gaps. They remain gaps today. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeology offered a final, unexpected source of recovery. Excavations in Egypt, particularly at sites like Oxyrhynchus, uncovered thousands of papyrus fragments, many containing texts that had not survived elsewhere. These were not scrolls from the Library of Alexandria itself, that is lost forever, but they were texts from the same period, copies that had circulated in provincial Egyptian towns, and had been preserved by the dry climate. Among these fragments were portions of lost plays, poems, and historical works. The discoveries were exciting, but also frustrating. The fragments were often small, damaged, incomplete. You might have a few lines of a play by Sophocles, enough to tantalize, not enough to understand the work as a whole. Still, every recovered line was a victory. A small piece of the ancient world returned to us. Modern scholars continue to work with these fragments, using new technologies to read texts that were previously illegible. Multispectral imaging can reveal writing on damaged papyrus. Computer algorithms can help piece together fragments that belong to the same document. It is painstaking work, requiring patience and expertise, but it occasionally yields remarkable results. In 2005, scholars using new imaging techniques were able to read previously invisible text on the Archimedes palimpsest, recovering a work on mechanical method that had been thought permanently lost. Such discoveries remind us that even now, 2,000 years after the library's decline, we have not completely given up hope of recovering what was lost. But we must be realistic. The vast majority of the library's collection is gone and will never be recovered. What survives is a fraction, perhaps 5% of Greek literature, perhaps less. We have more of some authors and genres than others, largely by accident. The works that were most popular in late antiquity, that were copied most frequently, had the best chance of survival. Works that were obscure or controversial, that appealed to a narrow audience, were likely to vanish. This means that what we have is not a representative sample of ancient literature. It is a sample skewed by the tastes and values of later ages. We have what medieval monks thought was worth copying, what Byzantine scholars thought was useful, what Renaissance humanists managed to find. We are missing the works that challenged orthodoxy, that proposed radical ideas, that were considered dangerous or subversive. These are often the most interesting works, and they are the ones we are least likely to ever recover. The story of what survived is ultimately a story about continuity and commitment. The texts we have today exist because someone at every stage of history decided they were worth preserving. A scholar in Alexandria copied a scroll before it deteriorated. A Byzantine scribe spent months copying that text onto parchment. A medieval monk, despite disapproving of its pagan content, preserved it in his monastery's library. A Renaissance humanist searched for it, found it, and had it printed. An archaeologist excavated it from the Egyptian sand. And now we, with our modern libraries and digital databases, continue that work, ensuring that these texts will be passed on to the next generation. This is the living tradition that connects us to Alexandria. The building is gone, the scrolls are dust, but the words survive, and as long as we continue to read them, to study them, to be inspired by them, the library, in some sense, lives on. In 2002, the Egyptian government, with international support, opened the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a modern library on a site near where the ancient library once stood. It is a beautiful building, a massive cylinder of glass and concrete, housing millions of books and manuscripts, equipped with the latest technology. It is not a reconstruction of the ancient library, such a thing would be impossible, but a tribute to it, a statement that Alexandria has not forgotten its heritage. The new library houses ancient manuscripts, hosts scholars from around the world, and serves as a center for learning in the modern Middle East. It is a symbol of hope, a promise that knowledge will be preserved, that the mistakes of the past will not be repeated, that we have learned something from the tragedy of the library's destruction. Whether this promise will be kept, whether future generations will prove more vigilant than past ones, remains to be seen, but the attempt is worthy. The memory is honored, and the dream of a library that contains all human knowledge, that serves as a beacon of learning for all peoples, this dream has not died. It has only moved, transformed, adapted to new times and new possibilities. The spirit of Alexandria endures. And so we come to the end of our journey through time, back through the centuries to our own present moment. We have walked the marble halls of the Maushin. We have held ancient scrolls in our hands. We have met the brilliant scholars who devoted their lives to knowledge. We have witnessed the library's golden age and its long, sad decline. We have mourned what was lost and celebrated what survived. Now it is time to reflect on what this story means, what lessons it holds for us, and why the Library of Alexandria continues to haunt our imagination more than 1,000 years after its destruction. The library represents something fundamental about human nature. We are the species that remembers. We tell stories. We record our observations. We pass on what we have learned to the next generation. This is what separates us from other animals. This capacity to accumulate knowledge across time, to build on the discoveries of those who came before us. Every human civilization has understood this, has created ways to preserve and transmit knowledge. But the Library of Alexandria represented this impulse at its most ambitious. It was not content to preserve the knowledge of one culture or one tradition. It sought to gather everything, from every civilization, in every language. It was an attempt at universal knowledge, at creating a complete record of human understanding up to that point in history. This is why its loss is so painful. It was not just the destruction of one institution, it was the destruction of a dream. The dream that we could know everything, that we could preserve everything, that nothing would be forgotten. The story of the library is also a story about the fragility of civilization. We tend to think of progress as inevitable, as a steady upward climb from ignorance to enlightenment. But history does not work that way. Civilizations rise and fall. Knowledge is gained and lost. The scholars of Alexandria knew things that would not be rediscovered for more than 1,000 years. The scientific progress of the Hellenistic age was followed by centuries of stagnation and decline. This is not because people became less intelligent. It is because the institutions that supported learning, the libraries, the schools, the royal patronage, all of these disappeared. When resources are diverted to war, when religious orthodoxy replaces intellectual curiosity, when people stop believing that knowledge is valuable for its own sake, then libraries close, scholars are silenced, and texts are lost. Progress is not guaranteed. It must be fought for in every generation. The library's destruction also reminds us of the cost of intolerance. The scholars of Alexandria came from many cultures and held many different beliefs. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, pagans, and eventually Christians all studied at the Mausoleum. The library's greatness lay partly in this diversity. When you bring together people from different traditions, who see the world through different lenses, the resulting conversation is richer, more complex, more likely to produce new insights. But this kind of intellectual pluralism requires tolerance, a willingness to engage with ideas you disagree with, to value truth over tribal loyalty. When that tolerance breaks down, when people start seeing different ideas not as opportunities for learning, but as threats that must be eliminated, libraries become targets, books are burned, scholars are murdered. The marketplace of ideas becomes a battlefield. This is what happened in Alexandria. The cosmopolitan culture that had made the library possible was replaced by religious certainty. Different perspectives were no longer tolerated, and so the library, which embodied that earlier openness, could not survive. Yet it would be wrong to paint this simply as a story of enlightened ancients and barbaric destroyers. The truth is more complex. The scholars of Alexandria, for all their brilliance, lived in a society built on slavery. The Ptolemaic kings who funded the library were not benevolent philosophers, but ruthless monarchs who maintained their power through force. The intellectual freedom of the Mausoleum was not available to everyone, only to a small educated elite. And the Christians who eventually came to dominate Alexandria were not simply anti-intellectual fanatics. Many of them were deeply learned, engaged in sophisticated theological debates that required careful reasoning and extensive knowledge of texts. The conflict was not between reason and superstition, but between different visions of what knowledge was for and what questions were worth asking. This complexity makes the story more relevant, not less. We face similar tensions today. How do we balance intellectual freedom with social responsibility? How do we preserve diverse perspectives while also maintaining some shared understanding of truth? How do we support institutions of learning in an age where resources are limited and priorities are contested? These are not easy questions, and the story of Alexandria does not provide simple answers, but it does remind us of what is at stake. The loss of the library was not just an ancient tragedy, it was a civilizational catastrophe that set back human progress for centuries. We cannot allow such a loss to happen again. The library also speaks to our relationship with the past. We are who we are because of those who came before us. The texts written by ancient scholars, the observations they made, the questions they asked, these shaped the development of human thought. When we lost the library, we lost part of our own history, part of our cultural memory. We became, in a sense, orphans, cut off from our intellectual ancestors. This is why the work of recovering and preserving ancient texts remains important. It is not just about studying the past for its own sake. It is about understanding ourselves, about recognizing the continuity of human experience across time, about honoring those who struggled, as we struggle, to understand the world and our place in it. In our own age, we face new threats to knowledge. Digital technologies have made information more abundant and accessible than ever before. We have, in a very real sense, achieved what the Library of Alexandria aspired to, a repository of all human knowledge available to anyone with an internet connection. But this abundance brings its own dangers. Digital information is fragile in ways that papyrus never was. A scroll could survive for centuries if stored properly. A digital file can be lost forever if the storage medium fails or the format becomes obsolete. We have already lost vast amounts of early internet content, websites that existed for years and then simply vanished when their servers shut down. The problem of preservation has not been solved by technology. It has only changed form. Moreover, we face a crisis of attention. When everything is available, how do we decide what is worth reading? The scholars of Alexandria faced the challenge of gathering knowledge. We face the challenge of filtering it, of distinguishing what is valuable from what is noise. In some ways, this is harder. At least the librarians of Alexandria knew that if they collected a scroll and put it on a shelf, someone might eventually read it. We drown in information, most of which we will never consume. How do we ensure that the most important knowledge, the texts and ideas that really matter, are not lost in the flood? This is the modern version of the challenge that Alexandria faced, and we have not yet found a satisfactory answer. Perhaps the deepest lesson of Alexandria is about impermanence. Everything we build will eventually fall. Every institution, no matter how grand, will one day cease to exist. The scholars who worked in the mountain believed they were preserving knowledge for all time, but time proved stronger. The scrolls decayed. The building crumbled. The traditions were broken. This is not a reason for despair, but it is a reason for humility. We should build as if our creations will last forever, but we should remember that they will not. We should preserve what we can, knowing that we cannot preserve everything. We should value the knowledge we have inherited, understanding how easily it could have been lost and how easily it could still be lost if we are not vigilant. The Library of Alexandria is gone. The scrolls are dust. The marble halls exist only in our imagination and in the fragmentary descriptions left by ancient writers. We can never walk those corridors as they truly were. We can never read the lost plays of Sophocles, or study the astronomical observations of Aristarchus in his own words. The past is lost to us, irretrievable, except for the fragments that survived. But those fragments are precious. They connect us to something greater than ourselves, to a tradition of learning and inquiry that stretches back thousands of years. When we read Euclid or Herodotus, when we study the texts that survived the library's destruction, we are participating in that tradition. We are keeping alive the dream that motivated Ptolemy to found the library in the first place, the dream that knowledge matters, that understanding is worth pursuing, that the accumulated wisdom of humanity is a treasure that must be protected and passed on. And so, as our story comes to a close, we are left with a question. What will we do with the knowledge we have inherited? Will we preserve it and build upon it? Will we pass it on intact to the next generation? Or will we allow it to slip away, lost through neglect or destroyed through fanaticism? The choice is ours. The responsibility is ours. The scholars of Alexandria could not prevent their library's destruction. They lived in turbulent times, and forces beyond their control swept away what they had built. But we have advantages they lacked. We have better technologies for preservation. We have a more complete understanding of history and of what happens when knowledge is lost. We have no excuse for repeating their tragedy. The library is gone, but its memory endures. It endures in the texts that survived. It endures in the new Bibliotheca Alexandrina, rising on the shores of the Mediterranean, a promise that the dream has not died. It endures in every library that collects and preserves knowledge, in every scholar who dedicates their life to understanding, in every reader who picks up an ancient text and allows themselves to be transported across the centuries. The marble halls are empty now. The scrolls are scattered ash, but the spirit of Alexandria, the belief in the value of knowledge, the commitment to preserving human wisdom, this cannot be destroyed unless we choose to let it die. And we must not make that choice. We owe it to the scholars who came before us. We owe it to those who will come after. We owe it to ourselves and to the dream of a world where knowledge is honored, preserved, and shared freely among all peoples. The night is deep now. The story has been told. The ancient library sleeps in the dust of ages, but its legacy lives in us. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. Thank you for listening to this story of what once was and what was lost. Remember Alexandria. Remember what it represented. Remember that knowledge is fragile, that civilization is fragile, and that we are the guardians of all that has been passed down to us. Sleep well, and may you dream of marble halls filled with scrolls, of lighthouse fires burning against the dark, of scholars bent over their work by lamplight, pursuing truth wherever it leads. Until we meet again in another corner of history, rest peacefully and carry with you the memory of the greatest library the world has ever known, the Library of Alexandria. What was lost, and what remains. The year is 331, before the Common Era. A young man, barely 30 years old, stands on the windswept coast of Egypt, gazing out at a thin strip of land that separates the Mediterranean Sea from Lake Maretis. His name is Alexander, and he is already called the Great. He has conquered the Persian Empire, subdued the Greek city-states, and marched his armies across thousands of miles of desert and mountain. But standing here, on this unremarkable stretch of Egyptian coastline, he sees something that his generals cannot. He sees a city that does not yet exist. He sees harbors filled with ships from every corner of the known world. He sees a lighthouse so tall it will guide sailors from 50 miles at sea. He sees libraries and museums, temples and palaces, a place where Greek culture and Egyptian wisdom will merge to create something entirely new. According to the ancient historians, Alexander himself traced the outline of his planned city in the sand and dust, using barley meal because chalk was not available. The shape he drew was that of a Greek chlamys, a traditional Macedonian military cloak, spreading outward in a semicircle from the coast. It was an auspicious beginning. Birds descended from the sky and ate the barley meal, which his seers initially interpreted as a bad omen. But Alexander's advisors reassured him. They said it meant the city would one day feed the entire world. Whether this story is true or legend hardly matters now. What matters is that Alexander saw the potential of this place, wedged between the sea and the lake, protected from the desert winds, positioned perfectly to serve as a gateway between Europe, Africa, and Asia. He gave orders for the city to be built, appointed the architect Dinocrates to oversee its construction, and then moved on. He would never see the city completed. Within a decade he would be dead, felled by fever in Babylon. At the age of 32, his vast empire already beginning to fracture under the weight of his generals' ambitions. But the dream of Alexandria did not die with Alexander. If anything, it grew stronger. One of Alexander's most trusted companions, a shrewd and calculating general named Ptolemy, moved quickly to secure Egypt for himself when the empire was divided among the successor kings. Ptolemy understood something that many of his fellow generals did not. He understood that power in the ancient world came not just from armies and gold, but from legitimacy, from culture, from being seen as the rightful heir to something greater than mere military conquest. He had Alexander's body brought to Egypt, a priceless relic that gave him a claim to be the true successor of the great conqueror. He established himself not as a foreign overlord, but as a pharaoh in the ancient Egyptian tradition, adopting their customs and respecting their gods while maintaining his Greek identity and culture. Ptolemy was a practical man, a soldier who had learned statecraft through decades of war and intrigue. He was not a dreamer like Alexander, but he recognized the value of dreams, especially when they could be turned to his advantage. He threw himself into the completion of Alexandria, transforming Alexander's sketch in the sand into a magnificent reality. The city was laid out in a grid pattern, a hallmark of Greek urban planning, with broad streets intersecting at right angles. The main avenue, the Canopic Way, stretched across the entire city from east to west, so wide that chariots could pass 8 abreast. Buildings rose from the foundations, constructed from local limestone and imported marble. Aqueducts were built to bring fresh water from the Nile. Gardens were planted. The city began to breathe. Within a generation, Alexandria had transformed from a dusty construction site into the jewel of the Mediterranean. Ships crowded its dual harbors, the great harbor to the north and the harbor of Eunostos to the west. These harbors were protected by a long natural breakwater, the island of Pharos, upon which Ptolemy's successors would build the famous lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The city's population swelled with Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Phoenicians, merchants, scholars, soldiers, and slaves. A dozen languages could be heard in the markets. 100 different gods were worshipped in temples scattered throughout the quarters. This was a cosmopolitan place, a melting pot, a city without parallel in the ancient world for its diversity and its energy. But Ptolemy wanted more than just a wealthy port city. He wanted Alexandria to be remembered not for its commerce, though commerce would make it rich, but for its culture. He wanted it to rival Athens, to surpass it, to become the undisputed intellectual center of the civilized world. This was partly vanity, to be sure. Every king wants to be remembered as a patron of the arts and sciences, but it was also strategic. A city famous for its learning would attract the best minds from across the known world, and those minds would bring with them knowledge, innovation, and prestige. They would legitimize the Ptolemaic dynasty as something more than mere warlords who had seized a province. They would make the Ptolemies custodians of civilization itself. And so, around 295 before the Common Era, Ptolemy founded an institution unlike anything the world had seen before. The Greeks had their philosophical schools, of course. Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum were famous centers of learning. But those were private institutions, dependent on the donations of wealthy patrons and the fees of students. What Ptolemy created was different. It was a state institution funded directly by the royal treasury, dedicated entirely to research and scholarship. It was called the Mausion, the Temple of the Muses, the home of those 9 divine sisters who inspired poetry, music, dance, astronomy, and all the other arts and sciences that elevated humanity above mere animal existence. The Mausion was not just a library, though the library would become its most famous component. It was a research institute, a university, a place where scholars could dedicate their entire lives to study without worrying about money or politics. They were given salaries by the king. They were provided with food and lodging. They were exempted from taxes. They had access to gardens and lecture halls, observatories and dissection rooms, botanical collections and zoological specimens. They could collaborate with their peers or work in solitude as their temperament dictated. And most importantly, they had access to scrolls, thousands upon thousands of scrolls, collected from every corner of the known world, representing the sum total of human knowledge up to that point in history. This was the library that would become legendary. This was the library that would haunt the imagination of scholars for 2,000 years after its destruction. It began modestly enough, with whatever texts Ptolemy could acquire from Greece and Egypt, but it grew with astonishing speed. Ptolemy II, who succeeded his father, pursued the collection of texts with an obsession that bordered on mania. He sent agents to Athens, to Rhodes, to Pergamum, to every city that had a reputation for learning, with instructions to buy, borrow, or copy every book they could find. He wrote to every king and ruler he knew, requesting that they send him copies of any works by poets, historians, physicians, or philosophers. He established scriptorium where teams of trained scribes worked day and night to produce copies of newly acquired texts. The methods used to build the collection were not always scrupulous. There is a famous story, recorded by the ancient scholar Galen, about how Ptolemy III obtained the official state copies of the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides from Athens. Athens guarded these texts jealously. They were considered national treasures, the definitive versions against which all other copies were checked. Ptolemy asked to borrow them, ostensibly so his scribes could make copies. He offered an enormous deposit as security, 15 talents of silver, a sum so vast that Athens agreed. The scrolls were sent to Alexandria. Ptolemy's scribes did indeed make copies, but when the time came to return the originals, Ptolemy kept them and sent the copies back to Athens instead. He forfeited the silver deposit without a second thought. To him, the authentic texts were worth far more than any amount of money. Athens was furious, but what could they do? Alexandria was too powerful, too distant, and besides, they had their copies, even if they were not the originals. Another story tells of an even more audacious practice. Ptolemy decreed that every ship that entered Alexandria's harbors had to surrender any scrolls it was carrying. These were taken to the library, where scribes quickly copied them. The originals were added to the library's collection, and the copies were returned to the ship's owners. This became known as the collection from the ships. Imagine the scene. A merchant vessel arrives in Alexandria after a long voyage from Athens or Antioch. The customs officials come aboard, as they always do, to inspect the cargo and collect duties. But they also ask if there are any books or scrolls on board. The captain, perhaps carrying his own personal copy of Homer or a medical text he uses to treat his crew, hands them over. Days or weeks later, he receives a newly made copy in return. The original is now property of the library. It is hard to say whether the merchants were angry or honored, perhaps both. But either way, the library's collection grew. Within decades, the Library of Alexandria held an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls. The exact number is disputed by historians and probably unknowable. Ancient sources give wildly different figures, and it is unclear whether they were counting individual scrolls or individual works, as a single long work might be divided across several scrolls. But even taking the most conservative estimates, this was an unprecedented accumulation of knowledge. No other institution in the ancient world came close. The library at Pergamum, its nearest rival, held perhaps 200,000 scrolls at its peak. Rome, the future master of the Mediterranean, barely had public libraries at all during this period. Alexandria had become what Ptolemy dreamed it would be. It was the intellectual capital of the world. Scholars came from Syria, from Greece, from Italy, from as far away as India and Persia, drawn by the reputation of the library and the promise of royal patronage. They came to study, they came to debate, they came to add their own contributions to the great project of understanding the universe and humanity's place within it. They came because Alexandria offered something that existed nowhere else, a chance to devote one's entire life to the pursuit of truth, supported by the wealth of a kingdom and surrounded by the greatest collection of knowledge ever assembled. And for a few precious centuries before the fires and the mobs and the slow decay of civilizations, this dream was real. Now imagine yourself walking through the gates of the Maushan on a morning in the 2nd century before the Common Era. The sun has just risen over the Mediterranean, casting long shadows across the marble courtyards. The air is still cool, touched by the sea breeze, and carries with it that distinctive scent of papyrus and ink that you have come to associate with this place. You are a visiting scholar, perhaps, come from Athens or Antioch to study at the feet of the masters who reside here. Or perhaps you are one of those masters yourself, a mathematician or astronomer who has been granted a permanent position by the king, given rooms and a salary and the freedom to pursue your research without interruption. Either way, you have access to this place, this temple of knowledge, and you are about to step inside. The Maushan complex was vast, occupying a significant portion of the royal quarter of Alexandria. Ancient descriptions suggest it was a collection of buildings rather than a single structure, arranged around courtyards and connected by colonnaded walkways. There were lecture halls where senior scholars delivered their teachings to students. There were smaller rooms for private study, where a researcher could work undisturbed on some difficult problem of geometry or astronomy. There were dining halls where the scholars took their meals together, engaging in the kind of intellectual conversation that often produced new insights. There were dormitories where resident scholars lived. There were gardens, carefully tended, where one could walk while contemplating some philosophical question. And there were the stacks, the storage rooms, the heart of it all, where the scrolls were kept. These storage rooms were carefully designed to protect their precious contents. Papyrus, the ancient paper made from the papyrus plant that grew abundantly in the Nile Delta, was remarkably durable when properly stored, but it was vulnerable to moisture and fire. The storage rooms were therefore built with thick walls to regulate temperature and humidity. They had small windows set high in the walls to provide light while minimizing exposure to the elements. The scrolls themselves were stored on wooden shelves that ran from floor to ceiling, organized according to a system developed by the librarians. Each scroll was tagged, labeled, and catalogued, so that a scholar looking for a particular work could find it without searching through hundreds of thousands of documents. The organization of the library was itself a monumental intellectual achievement. Early in the library's history, a scholar named Callimachus was tasked with creating a comprehensive catalogue of the entire collection. The result was called the Pinax, or tablets, a massive work running to 120 scrolls in itself. This was the world's first library catalogue, the ancestor of every index and database that would follow. Callimachus organized works by genre: literature, history, oratory, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, natural science. Within each category, works were further organized alphabetically, by author. For each entry, the Pinax provided the author's name, the title of the work, the opening words, the number of lines or scrolls, and biographical information about the author. It was a staggering feat of organization, and it made the library usable. Without such a system, the vast collection would have been little more than a warehouse of scrolls, impressive in scale but useless for research. Imagine requesting a scroll from a librarian. You approach the desk perhaps, where a scholarly-looking man sits surrounded by wax tablets and papyrus notes. You tell him you wish to consult Herodotus, his account of the Persian Wars. The librarian nods. He refers to his copy of the Pinax, finds the relevant section, notes the storage location, and sends an attendant to retrieve the scroll. Moments later, the attendant returns with a cylindrical case made of wood or leather. Inside is the scroll itself, a long sheet of papyrus perhaps 20 feet in length, rolled around a wooden rod. The librarian hands it to you carefully. He reminds you that this is a valuable document, perhaps the only complete copy of this work in existence. You must handle it with care. You must not take it from the library grounds. You must return it before the library closes for the evening. You carry the scroll to one of the reading rooms, a quiet space with a desk and a lamp. You unroll it carefully, revealing column after column of Greek text written in a clear professional hand. This is not the original manuscript, of course. Herodotus lived centuries ago. This is a copy, perhaps a copy of a copy, made by the library's scribes, but it has been carefully checked against other copies to ensure accuracy. You begin to read, following the ancient historian's account of King Xerxes' invasion of Greece, the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, the sea battle at Salamis. The words transport you. For a few hours you are no longer in Alexandria. You are marching with the Persian army, standing on the deck of a Greek trireme, watching the fate of civilizations hang in the balance. This was the daily reality of scholarship at the Maution. It was not glamorous work, not usually. It involved long hours of reading, of comparing texts, of making notes, of engaging in debates with colleagues about the meaning of a particular passage or the reliability of a particular source, but it was important work. These scholars were not merely preserving the past, they were analyzing it, questioning it, building upon it. They were engaged in the great project of human understanding, trying to figure out how the world worked, what principles governed it, what could be known, and what remained forever mysterious. The library employed a small army of scribes, whose job was to produce copies of texts, both to expand the collection and to replace scrolls that had become worn or damaged through use. These scribes worked in a dedicated scriptorium, a large room filled with desks where dozens of copyists might work simultaneously. Copying a text was painstaking work. A scribe would sit with the original scroll propped on a stand beside him and a blank papyrus sheet before him. He would carefully copy the text, word by word, line by line, trying to reproduce even the spacing and line breaks of the original. Accuracy was paramount. A single error could propagate through all future copies, distorting the author's meaning or introducing confusion. Senior scribes would check the copies against the originals, correcting mistakes before the copies were added to the collection. The materials used were simple but essential. Papyrus was made from the papyrus plant which grew wild along the Nile. The stalks of the plant were cut into thin strips, laid in perpendicular layers and pressed together. The natural juices of the plant acted as an adhesive, bonding the layers into a smooth writing surface. Individual sheets could be glued together to form scrolls of considerable length. The ink was made from soot or charcoal mixed with gum and water. It was applied with a reed pen, cut at an angle and split at the tip to hold the ink. A skilled scribe could write with remarkable speed and clarity, producing line after line of elegant Greek letters that would remain legible for centuries if the scroll was properly cared for. But the library did not only collect Greek texts. Alexandria was a cosmopolitan city, and its library reflected that diversity. There were scrolls in Egyptian hieratic and Demotic scripts, containing ancient wisdom from the age of the pharaohs. There were texts in Hebrew, including religious works and commentaries. There were Phoenician merchant records, Syrian astronomical observations, even some works translated from Sanskrit. The library's collection represented the knowledge of the entire known world, not just the Greek-speaking portion of it. This made Alexandria unique. While Athens remained the cultural heart of the Greek world, proud and insular, Alexandria looked outward, embracing the intellectual traditions of Africa and Asia as well as Europe. This openness extended to the scholars themselves. The Maution attracted researchers from across the ancient world. A scholar's ethnicity or place of birth mattered far less than their expertise and their dedication to learning. There were Egyptian priests studying astronomy and medicine alongside Greek geometers and philosophers. There were Jewish scholars translating and interpreting religious texts. There were Phoenician specialists in navigation and shipbuilding. The common language was Greek, the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean, but the ideas exchanged came from everywhere. This was perhaps the library's greatest achievement, not merely the accumulation of texts but the creation of an intellectual community that transcended national and cultural boundaries, united by a shared commitment to understanding. Of course, access to the library was not universal. This was not a public library in the modern sense. The Maution was a royal institution, funded by the Ptolemies and ultimately under their control. The scholars who worked there were supported by royal patronage and expected to produce work that would bring glory to the dynasty. Casual visitors could not simply walk in and request scrolls. Even visiting scholars needed letters of introduction or recommendations from established figures. The most valuable and rare texts were kept in secure areas, accessible only to senior librarians and specially authorized researchers. This was partly about protecting fragile documents from excessive handling, but it was also about maintaining the Maution's prestige and the king's control over knowledge itself. Nevertheless, for those who did have access, the library was a paradise. Imagine spending your days surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of humanity. Imagine being able to consult multiple versions of Homer's epics, comparing the differences and tracing how the text had evolved over centuries of oral and written transmission. Imagine having access to medical texts from Egypt and Babylon, comparing their approaches to disease and treatment. Imagine reading the lost plays of Greek dramatists, works that would vanish forever when the library was destroyed, experiencing stories and ideas that no one in the modern world will ever know. This was the opportunity the library offered. This was why scholars came from across the world, why they competed for positions here, why they considered it the highest honor to be associated with the Maution of Alexandria. As you sit in that reading room, the scroll of Herodotus spread before you, you are part of something larger than yourself. You are part of a community of scholars stretching back through the decades since the library's founding and forward into a future you cannot imagine. You are touching, quite literally, the same texts that your intellectual heroes touched, breathing the same air they breathed. The library is more than a building. It is more than a collection of scrolls. It is a living tradition, a chain of transmission, a promise that knowledge, once gained, will not be lost. At least, that is the promise. But promises, as you will discover, are fragile things. They can be broken by carelessness, by malice, by the simple passage of time. For now though, in this moment, in this room, with this scroll before you, the promise holds. The light is good. The text is clear. The world makes sense, and you are exactly where you should be. The true glory of the Library of Alexandria was not its scrolls, though they were precious beyond measure. The true glory was the minds that gathered there, the brilliant scholars who spent their lives in pursuit of knowledge and left behind legacies that would shape human thought for millennia. Let us meet some of these remarkable individuals. Let us walk with them through the colonnaded halls, sit with them in the gardens as they debate some fine point of philosophy or mathematics, and try to understand what drove them, what they discovered, and what they gave to the world. First among them, perhaps, is Euclid, the father of geometry. He arrived at Alexandria sometime around 300 before the Common Era, during the reign of Ptolemaios, and he established a school of mathematics at the Maution that would influence every subsequent generation of mathematicians. Euclid is famous for a single work, The Elements, though he wrote several others. The Elements is not merely a mathematics textbook, though it has served that function for more than 2,000 years. It is a monument to human reason, a demonstration of what the mind can achieve through pure logical deduction from a small set of fundamental assumptions. Euclid began with just a handful of axioms, statements so self-evidently true that they required no proof. For example, that a straight line can be drawn between any 2 points, or that all right angles are equal to one another. From these simple starting points, he constructed an entire system of geometric knowledge, proving hundreds of theorems through rigorous logical argument. Imagine Euclid at work, perhaps in a room in the Maution with a wax tablet before him, sketching diagrams and working through logical chains. He is an old man by this time, though we know almost nothing of his personal life. Ancient sources tell us almost nothing about Euclid the person. We do not know where he was born, whether he was married, what he looked like. All we have is his work, and that work speaks with a clarity and precision that has resonated across the centuries. When a student asks him whether there is any easier way to master geometry than working through all the proofs in the elements, Euclid supposedly replies, "There is no royal road to geometry. The story may be apocryphal, but it captures something essential about the man and his work. There are no shortcuts to understanding. You must work through the logic step by step, building your knowledge on a foundation of proof and reason." The influence of the elements cannot be overstated. It became the standard textbook for teaching mathematics not just in the ancient world but throughout the medieval period, the Renaissance, and well into the modern era. Abraham Lincoln studied Euclid by candlelight to sharpen his reasoning skills. Isaac Newton built his physics on Euclidean foundations. Even today, when students learn basic geometry in school, they are following in the intellectual tradition established by this scholar who worked in Alexandria more than 2,000 years ago. Euclid's work represents the Alexandrian ideal, the belief that through systematic inquiry and rigorous thought, humanity could unlock the fundamental truths of the universe. Another towering figure is Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who served as the chief librarian of Alexandria around 240 before the Common Era. Eratosthenes was a polymath, brilliant in multiple fields: mathematics, geography, poetry, astronomy, and history. His colleagues nicknamed him Beta, meaning number 2, because he was considered excellent at everything but the very best at nothing. If this was meant as an insult, it failed utterly. Eratosthenes' achievements would be remarkable even if he had specialized in a single field. That he excelled in so many makes him one of the most impressive intellects of the ancient world. His most famous achievement was measuring the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy, using nothing but geometric reasoning and careful observation. He had heard that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun shone directly down a well in Syene, a city far to the south of Alexandria in Upper Egypt. This meant the sun was directly overhead at that location and time. Eratosthenes reasoned that if the Earth was curved, the sun would not be directly overhead in Alexandria at the same moment. By measuring the angle of the sun's shadow in Alexandria at noon on the solstice, he could calculate the curvature of the Earth's surface between the two cities. He measured the angle at approximately 7 degrees, about 1/50th of a circle. He knew, or had estimated, the distance between Alexandria and Syene, about 5,000 stadia. Multiplying 50 times 5,000 gave him the Earth's circumference, 250,000 stadia. The exact value of a stadion varied in the ancient world, making it difficult to convert Eratosthenes' figure into modern measurements. But scholars believe his calculation was accurate to within about 2% of the true circumference. This is extraordinary. Eratosthenes proved that the Earth was round and calculated its size using only basic geometry, shadows, and reasoning. He did this at a time when much of the world still believed the Earth was flat, or at least had no way to prove otherwise. The implications were profound. If the Earth was a sphere of known size, then it was possible, at least in principle, to sail around it. Eratosthenes even speculated about what lands might lie on the opposite side of the globe, lands that would not be discovered by Europeans for another 17 centuries. Consider the scene. Eratosthenes, perhaps standing in one of the courtyards of the Maution, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun moves across the sky. He has a gnomon, a simple vertical stick placed in the ground, and he measures its shadow with careful precision at the moment of solar noon. Around him, other scholars go about their business, some pausing to watch, perhaps asking what he is doing. He explains his theory. Some are skeptical. How can you measure the world with a stick and a shadow? But Eratosthenes is patient. He shows them his calculations. He explains the geometry. And slowly the understanding spreads. The world is not flat. It is a sphere, and we can measure it. Then there is Aristarchus of Samos, an astronomer whose work at Alexandria led him to propose an idea so radical that it would be rejected by the ancient world and not revived for another 1800 years. Aristarchus argued that the Earth was not the center of the universe. Instead, he proposed that the Earth and the other planets revolved around the Sun. This heliocentric model of the solar system was based on careful astronomical observations and mathematical reasoning. Aristarchus noted that it was simpler to explain the apparent retrograde motion of planets, those odd moments when planets seem to move backward across the sky, if one assumed that the Earth itself was moving. If the Earth orbited the Sun along with the other planets, their apparent backward movement was merely an optical illusion caused by the Earth overtaking them in their orbits. The ancient world rejected Aristarchus' theory. It seemed absurd. Anyone could see that the Sun moved across the sky, rising in the east and setting in the west. The Earth felt solid and stationary beneath their feet. Moreover, if the Earth was moving through space, why did the stars not show parallax, an apparent shift in position as the Earth moved? Aristarchus had an answer. The stars were so incredibly far away that any parallax shift would be too small to detect with the naked eye. This was correct, but it required believing in a universe of almost unimaginable scale, and the ancient world was not ready for that leap. The geocentric model, with the Earth at the center, made more intuitive sense and fit better with prevailing philosophical and religious ideas. So Aristarchus' heliocentrism was set aside, remembered only as an interesting but incorrect speculation. It would take until the 16th century, when Copernicus revived the heliocentric model, for Aristarchus to be vindicated. By then, better observational tools and more refined mathematics made the sun-centered model increasingly difficult to deny. But the tragedy is clear. Had Aristarchus's work been preserved and taken seriously, humanity might have understood the structure of the solar system nearly 2,000 years earlier. The scientific revolution might have begun in Alexandria rather than Renaissance Europe. This is one of the great what-ifs of history, and it is directly tied to the loss of the library and the knowledge it contained. Another remarkable figure is Herophilos of Chalcedon, a physician who conducted the first systematic study of human anatomy. In the ancient world, cutting open human bodies, even dead ones, was generally considered taboo. The Greeks believed that the body should be buried intact, but in Alexandria, under the relatively liberal rule of the early Ptolemies, Herophilos was given permission to perform dissections. Some ancient sources even claim, though this is disputed, that he was allowed to perform vivisection on condemned criminals, cutting them open while they were still alive to observe the function of internal organs. Whether or not this gruesome practice actually occurred, Herophilos certainly conducted extensive dissections of corpses, and his observations revolutionized medical understanding. He discovered the distinction between arteries and veins, noting that arteries pulse with the heartbeat while veins do not. He described the structure of the eye in detail, including the retina and the optic nerve. He studied the brain and correctly identified it as the center of the nervous system, challenging the prevailing view, held even by Aristotle, that the heart was the seat of consciousness. He described the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, giving it the name it still bears today. He even calculated the pulse rate and recognized that variations in pulse could be used to diagnose disease. Imagine him at work in a dissection room somewhere in the Martian complex, carefully cutting away layers of tissue, sketching what he sees, making notes. The smell would have been terrible, the work grim, but the knowledge gained was invaluable. Herophilos wrote several treatises on his anatomical discoveries, but all of them were lost when the library was destroyed. We know about his work only through references and quotations in later medical texts. How much more could we have learned if his original writings had survived? How much faster might medical science have progressed if physicians throughout history had access to his detailed observations? These are questions that can never be answered, but they hint at the incalculable cost of the library's destruction. And then there is Callimachus, whom we have already mentioned, the poet and scholar who created the Pinax, the catalogue of the library. Callimachus was more than just a librarian, though that role alone would have been significant. He was a prolific and influential poet, writing hymns, epigrams, and a famous long poem called the Atia, which means causes or origins. This poem explored the origins of obscure rituals and customs throughout the Greek world, blending mythology with antiquarian scholarship. Callimachus believed in writing short, polished poems rather than long epics in the Homeric style. A big book is a big evil, he wrote, arguing that brevity and precision were more valuable than sprawling length. This philosophy influenced Hellenistic poetry for generations. Only a fraction of Callimachus' work survived the destruction of the library. We have some of his hymns, preserved because they were copied and recopied by Byzantine scholars who admired them. We have some of his epigrams, short poems preserved in anthologies. But the Atia, his masterwork, exists only in fragments, quotations preserved in other authors' works, and a few damaged papyrus scraps discovered in the sands of Egypt. To read these fragments is a bittersweet experience. The poetry is beautiful, witty, learned, everything you could want from a great poet. But the fragments are just that, fragments, tantalizing glimpses of a larger work that is lost forever. It is like trying to appreciate a symphony when you can only hear a few scattered notes. These scholars, and hundreds more like them, made Alexandria the intellectual center of the ancient world. They built upon the work of earlier thinkers and laid the foundations for everything that would come after. They argued and debated, criticized each other's theories, proposed new ideas, and slowly, painstakingly, expanded the boundaries of human knowledge. The library made this possible. It provided the resources, the community, the institutional support that allowed these brilliant minds to flourish. Without the library, Euclid might never have written the Elements. Eratosthenes might never have measured the earth. Aristarchus might never have conceived of a heliocentric universe. Herophilus might never have systematically studied human anatomy. Callimachus might never have catalogued the world's knowledge or written his poems. But the library did exist, at least for a time. For several centuries, it stood as a beacon of learning, a place where the best and brightest of the ancient world could gather to push the boundaries of what was known, to walk among these scholars, to overhear their conversations, to read their works in the very rooms where they were written. This would have been an experience of almost religious intensity. You would have felt the presence of genius, the electricity of ideas being born, the profound satisfaction of participating, even in a small way, in the great project of human understanding. And you would have believed, perhaps, that this would last forever, that knowledge once gained could never truly be lost. That belief, as we shall see, was tragically mistaken. Let us turn now to the scrolls themselves, those physical objects that contained all this accumulated knowledge. To truly understand what was lost when the library was destroyed, you must understand what a scroll was, what it felt like to hold one, how it was made, and how fragile it truly was. Close your eyes and imagine yourself holding one now. Feel its weight in your hands. Notice the texture of the papyrus, slightly rough, fibrous, the individual strips visible if you look closely. Smell the faint musty odor of old papyrus mixed with ink. This is not just a book. This is a connection to the past, a voice speaking across centuries. A papyrus scroll was typically about 20 to 30 feet long, though some were shorter and others much longer. The width varied, but a standard scroll was usually between 6 and 10 inches tall. The papyrus was made from the papyrus plant, Cyperus papyrus, which grew wild in the marshes of the Nile Delta. The manufacturing process was labor-intensive but well established. Workers would cut the stalks of the papyrus plant into thin strips. These strips were laid out side by side, forming a layer. Then another layer was placed perpendicular to the first. The two layers were pressed together, and the natural sap from the plant acted as an adhesive, bonding them into a single sheet. Multiple sheets could be glued together to create a scroll of the desired length. The writing surface was smooth enough to accept ink, but not perfectly smooth. You could feel the texture under your fingers as you unrolled the scroll. The ink was usually made from soot or lampblack mixed with water and gum arabic, creating a black liquid that dried quickly and remained legible for centuries if kept dry. The ink was applied with a reed pen, cut from a reed stem, sharpened to a point and split slightly at the tip to hold ink. A skilled scribe could write with remarkable speed and clarity, producing line after line of neat Greek letters, each column about 2 to 3 inches wide, separated by small margins. Reading a scroll required a particular physical technique. Unlike a modern book, which lies flat and allows you to read both pages at once, a scroll had to be held in both hands. You would unroll it with your right hand while rolling up the portion you had already read with your left. The text was written in columns perpendicular to the length of the scroll, so you would read down one column, then unroll a bit more to reveal the next column, read down that one, and so on. There were no page numbers, no index, no way to quickly flip to a specific passage. If you wanted to find a particular section, you had to remember approximately where it was located and unroll to that point, hoping you had estimated correctly. This physical format had significant implications for how ancient scholars worked. Comparing two texts side by side was difficult. You would need a large table to hold both scrolls unrolled to the relevant passages, or you would need to memorize one passage while consulting the other. Taking notes meant having a third scroll or a wax tablet beside you. The physicality of scholarship was very different from what we experience today with books, and even more different from the ease of searching digital texts. And yet the scholars of Alexandria managed extraordinary feats of research and synthesis despite these limitations. They were patient. They were methodical. They were willing to spend hours, days, weeks carefully comparing sources and working through arguments. The library's collection covered an extraordinary range of subjects, virtually the entire breadth of ancient knowledge. There were literary works, of course, the poems of Homer and Hesiod, the plays of the great Athenian dramatists, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, and Menander. There were histories, not only the famous works of Herodotus and Thucydides that we still possess, but hundreds of other historical accounts that are now lost forever. Imagine a comprehensive history of the Persian Empire written by a Persian scholar, offering a perspective entirely different from the Greek accounts we rely on. Such works almost certainly existed in the library, and they are gone. There were philosophical texts, the dialogues of Plato and the treatises of Aristotle, but also the works of countless other philosophers, whose names we barely know. There were medical texts, including the Hippocratic corpus and the anatomical writings of Herophilos. There were mathematical treatises, geometric proofs, astronomical tables, calculations of the movements of the planets. There were agricultural manuals, architectural guides, military handbooks, cookbooks, and collections of letters. There were religious texts from multiple traditions, Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and others. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was created in Alexandria, possibly with the resources and support of the library. The library also contained works in languages other than Greek. Egyptian texts written in hieratic and demotic scripts preserved the ancient wisdom of the pharaohs. Some of these texts were thousands of years old even in the Hellenistic period, recording knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and engineering that went back to the Old Kingdom. There were Phoenician texts, Hebrew texts, and possibly even texts in languages from as far away as India and Persia, though evidence for this is less certain. The library was not merely a repository of Greek culture. It was a repository of human culture, an attempt to gather and preserve the knowledge of all civilizations, all peoples, all ages. The scale of the collection is difficult to comprehend. Ancient sources give varying figures for the number of scrolls in the library, ranging from 400,000 to 700,000 at its peak. These numbers are uncertain and may include duplicates or multiple copies of the same work. But even if we take the most conservative estimate, we are talking about hundreds of thousands of individual documents. To put this in perspective, a typical ancient scroll could hold about 10 to 15,000 words of text. If the library contained 400,000 scrolls, that would be roughly 4 to 6 billion words of text. This was an amount of information that would not be matched again until the invention of the printing press nearly 2,000 years later. Managing such a vast collection was a monumental task. This is where the cataloging system developed by Callimachus became essential. Without some method of organization, the library would have been unusable, a vast warehouse of scrolls impossible to navigate. But Callimachus and his successors created a system that made the collection accessible. Scholars could request specific works and have them retrieved within a reasonable time. They could search for all known works by a particular author or on a particular subject. They could compare different versions of the same text to identify scribal errors or textual variants. This organizational infrastructure was just as important as the scrolls themselves. Without it, the library would have been a treasure hoard rather than a working research institution. The library also employed specialists to maintain and restore the scrolls. Papyrus is durable, but it is not indestructible. Scrolls that were frequently used would become worn. The ink might fade. The papyrus might tear or become brittle. Specialized scribes would repair damaged scrolls, carefully patching tears with new papyrus, re-inking faded text, or creating fresh copies when a scroll had deteriorated beyond repair. This ongoing work of preservation was essential. Without it, the collection would have slowly degraded over time, even without any dramatic act of destruction. Consider the daily life of a scroll in the library. It sits on its shelf, rolled tight, its wooden rod visible at one end, its title tag hanging from a cord. Days pass, perhaps weeks or months. Then a scholar requests it. An attendant retrieves it, carries it to the reading room, hands it carefully to the scholar. The scholar unrolls it, reads for several hours, perhaps making notes on a wax tablet or a separate papyrus. The scroll is returned to the attendant, who inspects it for any damage before returning it to its shelf. This cycle repeats countless times over the years. Each time, the scroll is handled, unrolled, rolled up again. Each time, there is a tiny amount of wear. But the library's staff is vigilant. They notice when a scroll is becoming fragile. They commission a new copy before the old one is lost. In this way, texts are preserved across generations, outliving the papyrus they were originally written on, outliving the scribes who copied them, outliving even the scholars who read them. The scrolls of Alexandria represented more than just information. They represented memory. They were the collective memory of human civilization up to that point in history. They contained the stories people told, the observations they made, the questions they asked, the answers they proposed. They preserved the voices of the dead, allowing them to speak to the living across the barrier of time. When you held a scroll and read the words written on it, you were engaged in an act of communion with the past. You were hearing the thoughts of someone who had lived and died centuries before you, but whose mind still spoke through the medium of written language. This is what makes the loss of the library so devastating. It was not just the physical destruction of papyrus and ink. It was the severing of that connection to the past. It was the silencing of voices that will never speak again. We know from references in surviving texts that the library contained works that would be invaluable to us today. We know the titles, sometimes the authors, occasionally even brief quotations, but the works themselves are gone. We can list what was lost, but we cannot recreate it. We are like someone who has heard a description of a beautiful song but has never heard the music itself. We can know that something existed and that it was precious, but we cannot experience it. We cannot know what it truly was. Imagine yourself back in that reading room, the scroll of Herodotus before you. You finish reading and roll it up carefully. You return it to the librarian. As you walk out of the Mauschen into the late afternoon light, you reflect on what you have just experienced. You have touched something ancient, something valuable, something irreplaceable. You have been granted access to a treasure. You have taken it for granted, perhaps, because it has always been here, because you assume it always will be. But nothing lasts forever. Not scrolls, not libraries, not civilizations. The seeds of destruction are already present, though you do not know it yet. Political instability, religious conflict, the slow decay of institutions. The library feels permanent, but permanence is an illusion. Everything that humans build will eventually fall. The only question is when and how much will be lost when it does. Alexandria was more than just a library. It was a city, a great cosmopolitan metropolis, that served as the stage upon which the drama of the library unfolded. To understand the library's place in the world, we must understand the city that housed it. Let us step outside the Mauschen's walls and walk the streets of Alexandria during its golden age. Let us see the city as a visiting scholar might have seen it, arriving for the first time, overwhelmed by the scale and grandeur of this impossible place. You arrive by ship, as almost everyone did, sailing across the Mediterranean from Athens or Rhodes or some other port in the Greek world. As your vessel approaches the coast of Egypt, you see it first from miles away, rising above the horizon like a pillar of light. This is the Pharos, the great lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It stands on the island of Pharos at the entrance to the harbor, a massive structure rising more than 300 feet above the sea. Ancient sources describe it as having 3 tiers, a square base, an octagonal middle section, and a circular top, each tier smaller than the one below it. At the summit, a great fire burned day and night, its light amplified by polished bronze mirrors that could project the beam for 30 miles across the water. The lighthouse is more than just a navigational aid. It is a symbol, a declaration of Alexandria's power and ambition. It says, "We are here, we are mighty, we command the sea." As your ship draws closer, the details of the city begin to resolve. You see the harbor crowded with vessels from across the known world, Egyptian grain ships, Phoenician traders, Greek warships, Roman merchantmen. You see the waterfront lined with warehouses and docks. You see rising behind the harbor the buildings of the city itself, white limestone and imported marble gleaming in the sunlight, punctuated by the green of gardens and the flash of gilding on temple roofs. Your ship docks in the great harbor, the primary port on the northern side of the city. The noise is overwhelming after the relative quiet of the sea voyage. Dockhands are shouting, cranes are creaking, cargo is being loaded and unloaded, merchants are haggling, sailors are cursing in a dozen different languages. The air smells of salt water, tar, fish, spices, sweat, and humanity. You make your way off the ship and onto the dock, your belongings in a pack or carried by a hired porter. A customs official stops you, inspects your baggage. If you are carrying any scrolls, they will be confiscated for copying, as we have already mentioned. You protest perhaps, but it is useless. This is Alexandria. The library's appetite for knowledge is insatiable. Once past the customs officials, you make your way into the city proper. The streets are laid out in a grid, a rational geometric pattern that makes navigation relatively simple even for a stranger. The main thoroughfare, the Canopic Way, runs east to west across the entire city, a magnificent avenue more than 100 feet wide. It is lined with colonnades on both sides, providing shade from the harsh sun. Beneath the colonnades are shops and workshops, taverns and market stalls, all doing a brisk business. The street itself is paved with stone, kept reasonably clean by municipal workers, though in the poorer quarters you will find dirt and filth like in any ancient city. You walk along the Canopic Way, heading east toward the Royal Quarter, where the Moutian is located. As you walk, you pass through different neighborhoods, each with its own character. The Egyptian Quarter, where the native population lives, is marked by the presence of temples to the ancient Egyptian gods, Isis and Osiris, Horus and Anubis. You hear the sound of ritual chanting and see priests with shaved heads performing their ceremonies. The Jewish Quarter is similarly distinct, organized around its synagogues, where you can hear the sound of Hebrew prayers and see men in traditional dress engaged in religious debates. The Greek quarters are more familiar to you, with temples to Zeus and Apollo, gymnasiums where young men exercise naked in the classical manner, and theaters where the plays of Sophocles and Euripides are still performed. Alexandria is a melting pot, perhaps the most diverse city in the ancient world. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Phoenicians, Syrians, Romans, and even visitors from as far away as India and sub-Saharan Africa, all live and work here side by side. The common language of commerce and government is Greek, specifically the Koine dialect that has become the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. But in the markets and neighborhoods, you hear a babble of tongues: Egyptian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Latin, Phoenician, languages you cannot even identify. This diversity is one of Alexandria's great strengths. It makes the city a crossroads of cultures, a place where ideas from different traditions can meet and interact, where Greek philosophy can encounter Egyptian mysticism, where Jewish monotheism can debate with Greek polytheism, where everyone is forced to think about their own beliefs and practices in the context of others. But this diversity also creates tensions. Different ethnic and religious groups do not always coexist peacefully. There are occasional riots, particularly between the Greek and Jewish communities who compete for political influence and economic opportunity. The Ptolemaic government tries to maintain order, but it is a delicate balance. The city is a powder keg, held together by prosperity and the strong hand of the royal administration. When that prosperity falters, or that administration weakens, violence can erupt suddenly and devastatingly. As you continue walking, you pass one of Alexandria's many public fountains, fed by the aqueduct system that brings water from the Nile. You stop to drink, the water cool and fresh, a relief from the heat of the day. Around the fountain, people gather, talking, arguing, laughing. This is the social life of the city, conducted in public spaces, in the markets, at the fountains, in the colonnaded walkways. Privacy is a luxury of the wealthy. Most people live in crowded apartment buildings, sharing small rooms with family members. They spend their days outside, working, socializing, conducting the business of life in the open air. Eventually you reach the Royal Quarter, the most magnificent part of the city. This is where the Ptolemaic Palace complex is located, a vast series of buildings covering perhaps a quarter or even a third of the entire city. The palace itself is off-limits to ordinary citizens, guarded by soldiers, but you can see its white marble walls and golden roofs rising above the surrounding buildings. The Moutian is part of this complex, connected to the palace by walkways and gardens. As a visiting scholar with proper credentials, you will be allowed to enter, but first you take a moment to appreciate where you are. You are standing in one of the great cities of the ancient world, Around you is wealth beyond imagination, knowledge beyond measure, and a level of urban sophistication that will not be matched again in Europe for more than 1,000 years. Alexandria at its peak has a population of perhaps 500,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world, rivaled only by Rome and perhaps by some of the great cities of China and India. It has paved streets, public libraries, a comprehensive water system, municipal fire brigades, and a police force. It has public baths, theaters, sports facilities, and parks. It is a planned city, designed and built according to rational principles rather than grown organically over centuries. This gives it a sense of order and grandeur that older cities lack. The lighthouse continues to dominate the skyline, visible from almost everywhere in the city. At night, its fire can be seen from the streets, a constant presence, a reminder of Alexandria's connection to the sea. The sea has made this city what it is. Trade routes converge here from all directions. Ships arrive from the Aegean laden with wine and olive oil, from the Black Sea with grain and timber, from Phoenicia with purple dye and cedar wood, from Arabia with frankincense and myrrh, from India with spices and gems. The wealth of the world flows through Alexandria's harbors, and a portion of that wealth stays here, enriching the city, funding its grand projects, supporting its scholars and artists. But the lighthouse is more than just a symbol of maritime power. It is also a symbol of enlightenment, of knowledge pushing back the darkness. The library and the lighthouse are twin expressions of the same impulse. The belief that humanity can illuminate the unknown, that we can create beacons that guide us through the darkness of ignorance and barbarism. The lighthouse guides ships to safe harbor. The library guides minds to truth. Both are fragile. Both can be destroyed. Both depend on constant maintenance and the commitment of resources. When civilizations decline, when priorities change, when wealth is directed toward war rather than learning, these symbols of enlightenment are among the first casualties. As the sun sets over Alexandria, the lighthouse fire is lit. You watch from the streets as the light grows brighter, as the mirrors catch and project it across the water. The city begins to take on a different character at night. Oil lamps are lit in windows and on street corners. The markets close, but the taverns open. Music drifts from courtyards. The smell of cooking fires fills the air. The city does not sleep, not entirely. There are always people in the streets, sailors from ships just arrived in port, merchants conducting late-night negotiations, philosophers arguing over wine, lovers meeting in secret. Alexandria is alive, vibrant, dangerous, and beautiful. This is the city that houses the library. This is the city that supports it, protects it, and benefits from its presence. The scholars who work in the Mauschen are part of this larger urban ecosystem. They do not live in isolation. They walk these streets. They shop in these markets. They attend these theaters. They are residents of Alexandria first, and scholars second. They are shaped by the city's cosmopolitanism, its openness to new ideas, its tolerance of diverse perspectives. The library could only exist here, in this particular place, at this particular moment in history. In a more provincial city, in a more closed-minded culture, such an institution would be unthinkable. But cities like libraries are fragile. They depend on continued prosperity, on political stability, on the maintenance of infrastructure. When trade routes shift, when wars drain the treasury, when religious zealotry replaces intellectual curiosity, cities decline. Alexandria will decline. The lighthouse will crumble. The streets will fall into disrepair. The cosmopolitan culture will give way to sectarian violence. And the library, that great repository of knowledge, will be caught in the middle, vulnerable to forces that neither its scholars nor its scrolls can resist. But for now, in this moment, in this golden age, all seems secure. The lighthouse burns. The library thrives. And Alexandria stands as proof that humanity can build something beautiful, something lasting, something that approaches, however briefly, the divine. The golden age could not last forever. Nothing does. The first great crisis to threaten the Library of Alexandria came not from religious fanatics or barbarian invaders, but from one of the most famous figures in ancient history, pursuing a woman he loved and fighting a war he did not fully understand. The year is 48 before the Common Era, and Julius Caesar has just arrived in Egypt. Caesar is at the height of his power, but also in the midst of a civil war. He has pursued his rival Pompey across the Mediterranean after defeating him at the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey fled to Egypt. hoping to find sanctuary with the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, only to be assassinated on the Egyptian shore by courtiers who hoped to curry favor with Caesar. When Caesar arrives in Alexandria, he is presented with Pompey's severed head. According to the ancient sources, Caesar weeps at this sight, mourning his former friend and ally despite their recent enmity. But Caesar's tears do not stop him from taking advantage of the situation. Egypt is rich, its treasury full, and Caesar's own finances have been strained by years of civil war. He decides to stay in Alexandria and settle the succession dispute between Ptolemy XIII and his sister wife Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra is one of the most famous women in history, though much of what we think we know about her is myth or Roman propaganda. She was not Egyptian by ancestry, but Greek, a descendant of Ptolemy V, the general who had founded the dynasty 3 centuries earlier. She was highly educated, probably the first of her line to actually speak Egyptian in addition to Greek, and she had studied at the Maushan itself. Ancient sources credit her with speaking 9 languages fluently. She understood mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and literature. She was intelligent, charismatic, and ruthlessly ambitious. She was also young, only 21 years old when Caesar arrived, and she saw in this powerful Roman general an opportunity to reclaim her throne from her brother. The famous story of Cleopatra being smuggled into the palace rolled up in a carpet to meet Caesar is probably true, though some sources say it was a linen sack rather than a carpet. Regardless of the details, she gained an audience with Caesar and quickly won him over, using her wit, her intelligence, and undoubtedly her physical charms. Caesar decided to support her claim to the throne. This decision plunged him into the middle of an Egyptian civil war, something he had not anticipated and was not prepared for. Ptolemy XIII, Cleopatra's brother, was only 13 years old, but he was backed by powerful advisors and a sizable army. When Caesar announced his support for Cleopatra, the Egyptian forces besieged the royal palace where Caesar had taken up residence. Caesar's own forces were small, only a few thousand legionaries who had accompanied him from Rome. He was outnumbered and in a precarious position, trapped in a hostile city, far from reinforcements. He needed to buy time for relief forces to arrive from Roman territories to the east. The critical battle took place in and around Alexandria's harbors. The Egyptian forces, supported by their navy, attempted to cut Caesar off from the sea. Caesar responded by attacking the Egyptian fleet, which was anchored in the harbors. The Romans set fire to the Egyptian ships to prevent them from being used against him. This is where the disaster occurred. The fire spread beyond the ships, fanned by the wind. It reached the waterfront warehouses and docks. These buildings were filled with flammable materials: rope, pitch, grain, and papyrus. The fire raged out of control, consuming everything in its path. Ancient sources differ on exactly what was destroyed in this fire. Some later writers claimed that the Library of Alexandria itself burned, that hundreds of thousands of scrolls were lost in the flames. But this is almost certainly an exaggeration or a misunderstanding. The main library, the one connected to the Maushan, was located in the royal quarter, some distance from the docks. It was built of stone, not wood, and was unlikely to have been directly threatened by a fire at the waterfront. What was destroyed were likely scrolls that were stored in warehouses, either awaiting shipment or recently confiscated from arriving ships for copying. These may have numbered in the tens of thousands, a significant loss to be sure, but not the catastrophic destruction of the entire library. Nevertheless, the psychological impact of the fire was enormous. For the first time in its history, the great library had been touched by violence. The scrolls, which had been accumulated with such care over 2.5 centuries, which represented the intellectual heritage of humanity, had been used as collateral damage in a petty military squabble. The scholars of the Maushan must have watched the smoke rising from the harbor with horror, wondering whether the flames would reach them, whether everything they had worked for would be consumed. The Alexandrian War, as it came to be known, continued for several more months. Eventually, Roman reinforcements arrived, and Caesar defeated Ptolemy's forces decisively. The young pharaoh drowned in the Nile while fleeing the battlefield. Caesar installed Cleopatra as queen, ruling jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, though everyone understood that she was the real power. Caesar stayed in Egypt for several more months, famously sailing up the Nile with Cleopatra in a luxurious barge, a pleasure cruise that scandalized the more conservative Romans back home. Some sources suggest that during this time Caesar visited the library and met with its scholars, though there is no definitive evidence of this. If he did visit, one wonders what he thought. This practical military man surrounded by books and intellectuals, did he understand what he had put at risk? Did he care? After Caesar's departure, Cleopatra worked to restore what had been lost. She understood, probably better than Caesar, the value of the library both as a symbol of Alexandria's cultural prestige and as a practical resource. There is evidence that she undertook efforts to replace the scrolls that had been destroyed and to repair any damage to the library's buildings and infrastructure. But the damage had been done, both physical and psychological. The library was no longer invulnerable. It could be threatened, it could be damaged, and if it could happen once, it could happen again. Years later, after Caesar's assassination and Cleopatra's alliance with Mark Antony, there is another famous story involving the library. Antony, trying to win Cleopatra's favor and perhaps assuage his guilt over Roman damage to her city, is said to have given her the entire library of Pergamum, the second greatest library in the ancient world, containing perhaps 200,000 scrolls. These were shipped to Alexandria and added to the collection, compensating for the losses suffered in the fire and perhaps even expanding the library beyond its previous size. The story is recorded in ancient sources, though some modern historians doubt its accuracy. Would Pergamum have simply handed over its entire library to Egypt? It seems unlikely, but even if the story is exaggerated, it points to a real effort by Cleopatra and her Roman allies to restore the library's prestige and rebuild its collection. Yet the damage from Caesar's war was not just about the number of scrolls lost, it was about the breaking of an illusion. For 2.5 centuries, the library had been protected by the wealth and power of the Ptolemaic dynasty. It had been above politics, above war, a sacred institution dedicated to knowledge rather than power. Caesar's fire shattered that illusion. The library was not above politics, it was not safe from war, it was vulnerable as any other building in Alexandria, and it was located in a city that was becoming increasingly unstable, increasingly caught up in the violent struggles of the late Roman Republic. The fire of 48 before the Common Era was the first blow, but it was not the killing blow. The library survived, damaged but intact. Scrolls were replaced, scholars continued their work, but something had changed. A shadow had fallen. The Golden Age was ending. The forces that would eventually destroy the library, the political instability, the religious conflict, the declining resources for intellectual pursuits, these forces were already in motion. They could not be stopped, only delayed. And so the library continued, entering a long twilight period where it remained famous and prestigious, but increasingly fragile, increasingly vulnerable to the changes sweeping through the ancient world. Consider the irony. The library, which had been founded by a general, Ptolemy I, was nearly destroyed by another general, Julius Caesar. It had been protected by kings who valued learning, and it was threatened by soldiers who valued victory. This tension between the life of the mind and the life of the sword is one of the enduring themes of human history. Civilization requires both, perhaps. You need soldiers to protect the borders, to maintain order, to project power. But you also need scholars, artists, thinkers, people who push the boundaries of knowledge and create works of lasting beauty and truth. When the balance shifts too far toward military might, when all resources are devoted to war, when intellectual pursuits are seen as a luxury rather than a necessity, that is when libraries burn. That is when civilizations begin their long, slow slide into darkness. Caesar's fire was a warning, a glimpse of what was to come, but no one heeded it. How could they? The library had always been there. Surely it would always be there. Surely something so precious, so obviously valuable, would be protected. This faith in permanence is perhaps humanity's most tragic failing. Nothing is permanent. Everything can be lost. And the more valuable something is, the more painful its loss when it finally comes. The centuries that followed Caesar's fire saw Alexandria and its library enter a long period of slow decline. This was not a sudden catastrophe but a gradual erosion, a steady draining away of resources, prestige and protection. The causes were many and interrelated: political, economic, cultural and religious. To understand how the library was finally destroyed, we must understand how the world around it changed, how the values that had created and sustained it gave way to new values that saw it as irrelevant at best and dangerous at worst. The Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 before the Common Era, after Cleopatra's defeat and suicide, transformed Alexandria from the capital of an independent kingdom into a provincial city of the Roman Empire. This had profound consequences for the library. Under the Ptolemies, the library had been a royal institution funded directly by the pharaoh's treasury, a matter of dynastic pride and prestige. The Ptolemies had poured enormous resources into the library because it enhanced their legitimacy and reputation. Under Roman rule, this direct royal patronage disappeared. Egypt was now governed by a Roman prefect appointed by the emperor. The revenues of Egypt, which were substantial, flowed to Rome, not to local institutions. The library had to compete for funding with other more pressing concerns such as military garrisons, infrastructure maintenance, and grain shipments to feed the Roman populace. Some Roman emperors did support the library. Hadrian, who visited Alexandria in the 130s of the Common Era, was known for his love of Greek culture and learning. He likely provided funds for the library and met with its scholars, but such imperial favor was sporadic and dependent on the interests of individual emperors. Many emperors never visited Alexandria at all and saw Egypt primarily as a source of grain and tax revenue, not as a cultural center deserving of investment. The library continued to function, but with reduced resources, fewer new acquisitions, and a gradually diminishing prestige. At the same time, the intellectual culture that had supported the library was changing. The great age of Hellenistic science and scholarship was over. The 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era had produced figures like Euclid, Eratosthenes, and Aristarchus, scholars who pushed the boundaries of human knowledge. By the Roman period, most scholarship had become more conservative, more concerned with preserving and commenting on the great works of the past than with producing new discoveries. There were still scholars at Alexandria, still important work being done, but the cutting edge of intellectual innovation had moved elsewhere, or perhaps simply dulled. The sense of excitement, of being at the forefront of human understanding, had faded. Part of this shift was due to changing philosophical fashions. The confident rationalism of the early Hellenistic period, the belief that through reason and observation humanity could understand the natural world, was giving way to more mystical and religious philosophies. Neoplatonism, which emphasized spiritual experience and the contemplation of divine reality over empirical investigation, became increasingly popular. This was not necessarily hostile to scholarship. Neoplatonist philosophers still read and commented on Plato and Aristotle, but it represented a turning away from the kind of scientific inquiry that had characterized the library's golden age. The questions that interested people were changing. Instead of how does the universe work, they were asking how can I achieve union with the divine. These are both legitimate questions, but they lead to very different kinds of investigation and require very different kinds of resources. More significantly, the rise of Christianity fundamentally altered the religious and intellectual landscape of the Mediterranean world. Christianity began as a small Jewish sect in the 1st century, but grew rapidly, spreading throughout the Roman Empire despite periodic persecutions. By the 4th century, it had become the dominant religion, officially favored by the Emperor Constantine and his successors. This religious transformation had enormous implications for institutions like the Library of Alexandria. Early Christianity was suspicious of pagan learning. The great works of Greek philosophy and science, the very texts that filled the shelves of the library, were seen by many Christians as the products of a false and demonic culture. The philosophers had not known the true God. Their wisdom, no matter how impressive, was ultimately worthless because it was not grounded in divine revelation. Some Christian thinkers, particularly those influenced by Greek education themselves, tried to reconcile pagan learning with Christian faith. They argued that the best of Greek philosophy could be seen as a preparation for the gospel, that truths found through reason were compatible with truths revealed by God. But this was a minority position, at least in the early centuries. The dominant attitude among Christians was one of hostility or indifference to the classical tradition. This hostility was not merely intellectual. As Christianity gained power, Christian mobs, often encouraged by their bishops, began attacking pagan temples and institutions. In 391 of the Common Era, the Serapeum, a magnificent temple complex in Alexandria that also housed a daughter library connected to the main Mausoleum, was destroyed by a Christian mob led by the Patriarch Theophilus. The Serapeum had been one of the great landmarks of the city, a temple to the syncretic Greco-Egyptian god Serapeus, filled with statues, inscriptions, and thousands of scrolls. Theophilus, with the approval of the Emperor Theodosius, led his followers in an assault on the temple. They tore down the statues, smashed the altars, and burned or scattered the scrolls. This was not an accident or an unintended consequence. It was a deliberate act of destruction, motivated by religious zeal and a desire to eradicate paganism. The destruction of the Serapeum is often cited as the effective end of the Library of Alexandria, though the relationship between the Serapeum's library and the main library at the Mautian is unclear. Some scholars believe that by the late 4th century, the Serapeum had become the main repository of scrolls, that the original library had already declined or been dispersed. Others argue that the two were always separate institutions, and that the destruction of the Serapeum, while tragic, did not directly affect the main library. The truth is lost to time. What we know is that after 391 there are fewer and fewer references to the library in ancient sources. The institution that had once been the intellectual center of the world fades from the historical record, dying not with a dramatic conflagration but with a quiet whimper. The reasons for this fade are complex. Part of it was simply economic. Alexandria, while still a major city, was no longer the thriving commercial hub it had been under the Ptolemies. Trade routes were shifting. The rise of Constantinople as the new imperial capital in the east drew resources and attention away from Alexandria. The city's population was declining. Its buildings were falling into disrepair. There was less money for luxuries like libraries, and to a government focused on survival in an era of increasing barbarian invasions and internal strife, a library was definitely a luxury. Part of it was cultural. The intellectual elite of the Roman Empire, the people who had once traveled to Alexandria to study, were increasingly Christian. Their education was centered on scripture and theology, rather than Plato and Aristotle. The classics were not forbidden, exactly, but they were no longer central to a good education. A Christian bishop had little use for Euclid's geometry or Aristarchus's astronomy. What mattered was understanding the Bible, the Church Fathers, the intricacies of theological debate about the nature of Christ. The library, with its vast collection of pagan texts, was increasingly irrelevant to this new intellectual culture. And part of it was simply neglect. Libraries require constant care. Scrolls must be copied and recopied as they deteriorate. Roofs must be maintained to keep out rain. Shelves must be repaired. Staff must be paid. When funding dries up, when no one is appointed to oversee the collection, when the building itself is seen as just another piece of municipal real estate rather than a sacred trust, decline is inevitable. It is quite possible that the Library of Alexandria did not burn in a dramatic fire but simply decayed, its scrolls moldering in the damp air, its shelves emptying as scrolls were lost or removed and never replaced, its halls growing quieter and quieter until one day there was nothing left but empty rooms and the memory of what had once been. By the time of the Arab conquest of Alexandria, in 641 of the Common Era, there is no evidence that the library still existed in any meaningful form. The famous story that the Arab general Amr ibn al-As burned the library on the orders of Caliph Umar, who supposedly said, "If these books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary, and if they disagree, they are harmful," is almost certainly a myth, invented centuries later by Christian chroniclers to discredit Islam. The story does not appear in any contemporary sources and contradicts everything we know about the Arabs' actual treatment of libraries and learning, which was generally respectful and preservative. If Amr burned anything, it was not the library, because the library was already gone. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria was not a single event but a process spread over centuries. It began with Caesar's fire, which destroyed part of the collection and shattered the illusion of the library's invulnerability. It continued with the slow decline of Roman support and the changing intellectual climate. It accelerated with the rise of Christianity and the destruction of pagan institutions like the Serapeum. And it concluded with simple neglect, as generations passed with no one willing or able to maintain what had once been the greatest library in the world. This is perhaps the most painful aspect of the story. The library did not have to be destroyed. It could have been preserved. But preservation requires will, resources, and a cultural consensus that the thing being preserved is valuable. When that consensus broke down, when people stopped caring or actively came to see the library as a relic of a discredited pagan past, its fate was sealed. No dramatic villain was needed. Time and indifference were sufficient. There is one figure whose fate became tragically intertwined with the final years of the library, a woman whose death has come to symbolize the end of classical learning and the triumph of religious fanaticism over reason. Her name was Hypatia, and she was the last great scholar of Alexandria, a mathematician and philosopher who represented everything the library had once stood for. Her story is one of brilliance, courage, and ultimately horrific violence. Hypatia was born around 360 of the Common Era, the daughter of Theon, a distinguished mathematician and astronomer who was one of the last members of the Mautian. He educated her himself, training her in mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. She proved to be extraordinarily gifted, eventually surpassing her father in reputation. By her 30s, she had become the leading intellectual figure in Alexandria, teaching both publicly and privately, writing commentaries on mathematical works, and serving as an advisor to the city's leading citizens. She was a Neoplatonist philosopher, following in the tradition of Plotinus, teaching that through rational contemplation and ethical living the soul could ascend toward union with the Divine One. Hypatia was remarkable, not just for her intellect, but for the respect she commanded in what was very much a man's world. Ancient sources describe her as beautiful, but completely uninterested in marriage or romantic relationships. She devoted herself entirely to philosophy and teaching. She dressed in the simple robes of a philosopher and moved through the city with confidence, lecturing in public spaces, engaging in debates, earning the admiration even of those who disagreed with her. In a letter that survives, one of her students, Synesius of Cyrene, who became a Christian bishop, addressed her with profound respect, calling her mother, sister, teacher, and benefactor. But Hypatia lived in dangerous times. Alexandria, in the early 5th century, was a city torn by religious and political conflict. The Christian population was divided into rival factions fighting over theological questions that seem obscure to modern readers, but were matters of life and death to them. The city's pagan minority, of which Hypatia was a prominent member, was increasingly marginalized and threatened. The Patriarch of Alexandria, Cyril, was a fierce and ambitious man who saw the elimination of paganism as his sacred duty. He had already expelled the city's Jewish population in a pogrom. Now he turned his attention to the remaining pagans. Hypatia became a target for several reasons. She was pagan and made no secret of it. She was a woman who refused to conform to the subordinate role that Christianity prescribed for women. She was close to Orestes, the Roman prefect of Alexandria, who was engaged in a power struggle with Patriarch Cyril. Her public prominence, her intellectual authority, and her political connections made her a symbol of everything Cyril and his followers opposed. In their eyes, she represented the old pagan order that had to be destroyed before Alexandria could become a truly Christian city. The sources differ on the exact details of what happened next, but the essential facts are clear and horrifying. In March of 415, Hypatia was traveling through the streets of Alexandria in her chariot when she was ambushed by a mob of Christian zealots, possibly monks from the desert, led by a reader at Cyril's church named Peter. They dragged her from her chariot, stripped her naked, and pulled her into a church. There they murdered her using roof tiles or oyster shells, scraping the flesh from her bones. They then tore her body apart and burned the remains. The murder was public, brutal, and deliberate. It was meant to send a message. This is what happens to those who cling to the old ways, to those who value pagan philosophy over Christian truth. The reaction to Hypatia's murder was mixed. Some Christians, including Hypatia's student Synesius, were horrified. They saw it as a crime, a stain on the church's honor, but others saw it as justified, even praiseworthy. Hypatia had been a dangerous sorceress, they said, who led men away from God with her seductive philosophy. Her death was necessary. Patriarch Cyril, though he may not have directly ordered the killing, certainly created the atmosphere in which it could occur, and he made no effort to punish those responsible. In fact, Peter the Reader, the man who led the mob, was later venerated as a saint by some factions of the church. Hypatia's death marked a turning point. It was not the end of pagan philosophy in Alexandria that came gradually over the following decades, but it was a signal that the intellectual freedom that had characterized the city for 700 years was over. Scholars who valued their lives kept quiet. Philosophers stopped teaching publicly. The city that had once welcomed thinkers from across the world became a place where the wrong opinion could get you killed. The library, if it still existed in any form, would have been a place of fear rather than enlightenment. Modern historians debate Cyril's culpability in Hypatia's death. Some argue that he deliberately incited his followers, knowing that violence would result. Others suggest that he lost control of the mob, that the murder happened despite rather than because of his wishes. But regardless of his personal intentions, the effect was the same. A brilliant woman, a teacher, a seeker of truth, was murdered by religious fanatics who saw knowledge as a threat. The classical tradition of rational inquiry, of valuing wisdom wherever it was found, of respecting teachers regardless of their religious beliefs, this tradition died with Hypatia in the streets of Alexandria. There is a bitter irony in the fact that the church where Hypatia was murdered was named after Caesarion, the son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. The building that had once been connected to the royal family that founded and supported the library had become a place of execution for one of the library's last inheritors. The cycle had come full circle. The library had survived Caesar's fire only to be undone, not by foreign conquerors or natural disaster, but by the religious intolerance of those who saw the pursuit of knowledge as a form of heresy. After Hypatia's death, the intellectual life of Alexandria continued to decline. Some scholars fled to other cities where they felt safer. Others converted to Christianity, abandoning their philosophical pursuits or redirecting them toward theological questions. The schools that had once taught mathematics and astronomy now taught scripture and doctrine. The tradition of free inquiry that had made Alexandria great was replaced by an emphasis on orthodoxy and obedience. Questions were discouraged. Doubt was sinful. Truth was not something to be discovered through observation and reason, but something to be accepted on authority. This change was not unique to Alexandria. It was happening throughout the Roman world as Christianity consolidated its power. Ancient learning was not completely abandoned. Some Christian scholars, particularly in monasteries, continued to copy and preserve classical texts. They recognized that works of grammar, logic, and rhetoric were useful for reading and interpreting scripture. But the spirit had changed. Knowledge was no longer pursued for its own sake, as a way of understanding the universe and humanity's place in it. Instead, it was valued only insofar as it served religious purposes. Anything that contradicted scripture or church teaching was rejected, no matter how carefully reasoned or well evidenced it might be. The library, which had embodied the opposite approach, which had collected texts from all traditions and allowed scholars to question everything, could not survive in this new intellectual climate. Even if the building had still been standing, even if scrolls had still lined the shelves, the institution would have been dead. A library without intellectual freedom is not really a library. It is a warehouse of approved texts, a tool of indoctrination rather than enlightenment. It is important, however, not to oversimplify this history, or to paint it as simply a story of ignorant Christians destroying enlightened paganism. Many early Christians were highly educated and valued learning. The transition from pagan to Christian culture preserved much of the classical heritage, even as it transformed it. Medieval monasteries, despite their limitations, did save countless ancient texts that would otherwise have been lost, and pagan culture, for all its intellectual achievements, had its own forms of intolerance and violence. The same Alexandrian mob that murdered Hypatia had, in earlier centuries, participated in pogroms against Jews and riots against unpopular governors. Violence and fanaticism are not unique to any one religion or ideology. But Hypatia's death does mark something important. It marks the moment when a certain kind of intellectual openness, a certain willingness to question and to tolerate different perspectives, was replaced by religious certainty. In the centuries that followed, when someone asked a question about the nature of the universe, the acceptable answer was God made it, or the scriptures say this. The idea that you could investigate the question yourself, that you could use observation and reason to arrive at answers that might challenge established beliefs, this idea was suppressed. And with it, much of the progress that had been made in science, medicine, and philosophy was lost or forgotten. The library could not have survived this change. It was built on the opposite premise, that knowledge came from human inquiry, from reading widely, from comparing different accounts, from thinking critically. When that premise was rejected, when the very idea of free inquiry became suspect, the library's days were numbered. Hypatia's murder was not the moment the library died. That death had been happening slowly for centuries. But it was the moment when the world that had created and sustained the library was definitively replaced by a different world, one that had no use for such an institution, one that saw it not as a treasure to be protected, but as a relic of a discredited past, best forgotten or destroyed.